The first bullets struck the castle walls just after dawn, stone dust spraying into the air like ash, and drifting across the courtyard where a handful of men crouched behind overturned tables and sandbags. Machine gun bursts cracked from the forest below. Every window became a target, and every sound was an echo of disbelief, because the men inside Castle Itter that morning were not supposed to be fighting together. On one side of the barricades were American soldiers in muddy uniforms, exhausted and half-starved from days of pursuit, and on the other side, wearing the gray of the Wehrmacht, were German soldiers who only a week earlier had been their enemies. Somewhere in the middle, pacing behind the thick medieval walls, were the most valuable hostages in Europe, French generals, ministers, and aristocrats captured years earlier by the Reich. Now, as the SS moved in to erase witnesses and the Americans struggled to hold a crumbling fortress, the last coherent sentence of the Second World War was being written not in Berlin or Tokyo, but here, in a forgotten Austrian valley where enemies had joined forces to keep each other alive. 2 days earlier, the castle had been silent. The war was ending everywhere, but not cleanly. Germany was collapsing in fragments, and each fragment had its own idea of surrender. Some fought to the last breath, while others simply waited for whoever reached them first, Americans from the west or Soviets from the east. Castle Itter sat high above the Tyrol, perched like a stone crown on a ridge of spruce forest. It had once been a noble's estate, then a hotel, and in 1943, the SS had turned it into a private prison for honored captives, men too famous to kill, but too inconvenient to free. There they kept former French Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, generals like Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, even Charles de Gaulle's sister Marie Agnès. They were treated better than most prisoners, with private rooms, small meals, and a library. But as Germany began to burn, the guards grew nervous and the outside world vanished. The prisoners could hear distant artillery, dull thunder rolling closer each day. On May 3rd, the SS commandant fled without warning, leaving behind a skeleton guard and a few local auxiliaries who didn't know what to do next. For the first time in years, the French captives had control of the gates, but freedom was a death sentence. The roads below swarmed with retreating SS units, fanatics who shot deserters and civilians alike. That night, one prisoner, a wiry tennis champion named Jean Borotra, volunteered to escape through the forest to find help. He had played before kings, served under generals, and now crawled through moonlit pines with a stolen rifle slung across his back, heading west toward the rumble of American guns. 20 miles away, an American reconnaissance platoon was moving cautiously through the Tyrolean countryside. Lieutenant Jack Lee, a tank commander with the 23rd Tank Battalion, had expected surrendering Germans, not refugees talking about a castle full of VIP prisoners. He dismissed the first rumors as legend until a civilian brought him a note scrawled in French, begging for immediate rescue. The letter described the situation in frantic detail. The SS were regrouping in the nearby valley of Wörgl, preparing to eliminate the French prisoners. The only defenders were a few Austrians and friendly German soldiers under a major named Josef Gangl. Lee read it twice. Friendly German soldiers. He looked at his men, dirty, sleepless, too tired to laugh at what sounded like a trap. But something about the handwriting and desperation made him hesitate. Major Gangl was real. He had commanded an artillery battery in the Wehrmacht, but as the Reich began devouring itself, he and his men had turned their guns against the SS to protect civilians in Wörgl. Now he was hiding from both sides, hunted by the SS for treason and distrusted by Americans as another Nazi officer. When Borotra stumbled into Wörgl and found him, half frozen and bleeding, Gangl didn't hesitate. The war was lost. The only thing left was decency. He gathered 10 of his remaining soldiers and a white flag, loaded them into a truck, and drove toward the American lines to plead for help. When the two groups met, Lee's Sherman crew and Gangl's weary Germans, no one moved for a moment. Rifles stayed raised. The wind carried the smell of pine and diesel. Then Gangl stepped forward, helmet under his arm, and said in perfect English, "I am not your enemy. The SS will kill those people if we don't reach them first." Lee looked him over. The man's uniform was scorched, insignia torn off. He had the eyes of someone who had stopped caring who won. "Fine," Lee said finally. "Let's go get them." They set off in a small column, one Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny, a jeep, and a handful of trucks carrying a dozen Americans and about as many Germans. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. A tank painted with white stars leading a convoy guarded by Wehrmacht infantry, driving together into territory still crawling with SS units. As they climbed the mountain road, the sky faded from gray to silver, and in the distance Castle Itter rose like a ghost above the tree line. No one knew how many SS troops were nearby. The radio crackled only with static. When they reached the gate, the French prisoners could hardly believe what they saw. Americans and Germans standing side by side, exchanging ammunition, checking each other's weapons. Some of the French burst into laughter, others simply stared in silence. After years of captivity, the world outside had turned upside down. Inside the castle, Lee and Gangl organized defenses as if they'd known each other for years. The Sherman was positioned at the main gate to cover the road, riflemen manned the parapets and towers, and the French VIPs were moved to the basement for safety, though some insisted on staying to fight. Maurice Gamelin, the aging general who had commanded France in 1940, insisted on holding a rifle, and Paul Renaud demanded to send a message to the approaching Americans. "Tell them we are surrounded but proud." By late afternoon, the first SS scouts appeared among the trees, black uniforms moving like shadows through the fog. Lee's men held their fire. The radio operator kept trying to contact nearby units, but no signal came back. Then, at 4 a.m. on May 5th, the attack began. Machine guns from the forest ripped across the outer walls, and the Sherman answered with a single deafening burst from its 50 caliber gun, shattering the silence and the gatehouse roof. Shells clanged against stone. Fragments whined through the courtyard. Inside, the Americans and Germans fought shoulder to shoulder. Gangl directed his men calmly, shouting in German for suppressive fire, while Lee darted between positions, cursing at his radio and telling the French to stay down. The defenders were outnumbered 10-1. Through binoculars, Lee could see at least 100 SS troops maneuvering uphill, seasoned fanatics desperate to prove their loyalty before the end. At one point, the Sherman's machine gun jammed, and Lee climbed up himself to clear it, standing exposed as bullets chipped stone around him. When a sniper's shot tore through the tank's periscope, Gangl dragged an American gunner out of harm's way, shouting orders in both languages at once. For hours the battle seesawed, smoke filling the courtyard, the wounded lying against the walls, clutching rifles they could no longer lift. Every time the defenders thought the SS had retreated, another wave came. By noon, the Sherman's ammunition was nearly gone, the Germans' rifles clicked empty, and the French prisoners, some in slippers and dressing gowns, carried belts of ammunition from room to room. Then came the cry no one wanted to hear. "They're flanking from the east!" Gangl sprinted across the courtyard toward a sniper's perch, trying to spot the new threat, when a burst of machine gun fire struck him in the chest. He fell without a sound. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the Americans froze. The man who had been their enemy, the German who had chosen honor over obedience, lay dead on the stones. Lee knelt beside him, staring at the blood seeping into the cracks, then stood, jaw set, and yelled, "Hold this damn castle!" Down in the valley, reinforcements were finally on the move. A larger American armored column under Captain John Lee, no relation, had intercepted Barotra, the escaped French tennis star, running down the road in exhaustion. Between breaths, he gasped out the words that would send them racing uphill. "They are dying up there!" By the time the tanks reached the base of the ridge, the defenders at Castle Itter had been fighting for nearly 12 hours. Ammunition almost gone, smoke pouring from shattered windows, the SS within 50 yards of the gate. Then, through the thunder of gunfire, came a new sound, the deep rhythmic growl of engines. American tanks. The S-line broke. Some ran, others dropped their weapons. The castle defenders, stunned and half-deaf, watched as the valley erupted with the sound of salvation. The relief column stormed the ridge, clearing the forest in minutes, and when they entered the courtyard, they found Americans, Germans, and French all mixed together, exhausted, filthy, alive. And for one brief moment, the war's chaos made sense. When the last gunshots faded and the forest fell silent, Castle Itter stood like a broken crown against the gray evening sky, its walls scorched and bleeding smoke. The defenders could barely hear anything but the ringing in their ears, the echo of battle still trapped between the stones. Lieutenant Jack Lee climbed down from his tank, his boots crunching on spent shells, and for a moment he simply looked around, trying to understand what had just happened. A day earlier, he had been hunting remnants of a dying enemy. Now he had fought side by side with them. Beside him, German Corporal Sepp Gangl's men, those who still breathed, moved carefully among the wounded, dragging bodies out of the courtyard, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. The air was heavy with cordite, and the faint sweetness of pine sap from the shattered trees beyond the walls. In one corner lay Major Josef Gangl, his uniform torn open, his chest dark with blood. An American medic knelt beside him, fingers on his throat, then shook his head. Lee removed his helmet and stood over the body in silence. "He saved more lives today than most generals in this whole damn war," he murmured. Nearby, the French prisoners, men who had once ruled ministries and commanded armies, stood in a huddle like schoolboys who had just survived a storm. Paul Renaud, his hair disheveled, stared at the German dead with a strange, haunted respect. General Gamelin, still gripping the rifle he had insisted on carrying, whispered, "So this is what the end looks like." The sun dipped low behind the Alps, turning the smoke into molten gold. And for the first time since 1939, no one was shooting. They buried Gangl before nightfall in a patch of earth beside the castle's outer wall. There was no priest, no ceremony, only soldiers and former prisoners standing in a rough circle, their boots sinking into the soft mud. A German sergeant said a few words, his voice trembling, then fell silent. Lee placed a single spent cartridge on the mound of dirt as a marker. "He fought for the right side at the end," he said quietly, and the men around him nodded. When darkness came, they built fires inside the courtyard to keep warm. The French officers brought out what little wine they had hoarded, sharing it in tin cups with the Americans and the surviving Germans. The first sip tasted of smoke and dust, but it loosened something in everyone. Conversation started in fragments, English mixing with German and French, laughter breaking through in short bursts, disbelief turning slowly into relief. Someone found a gramophone in a storeroom and wound it carefully until a record crackled to life. The tune was faint and scratchy, but it filled the night with something that felt almost holy. Men who had been enemies 3 days earlier now sat shoulder to shoulder, passing bottles and stories, each of them knowing this moment could never happen again. Outside the walls, the war still dragged on. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was already dead by his own hand, but no one here knew it yet. In Prague and northern Italy, isolated SS units still fought with fanatic fury. The men at Castle Itter had no idea whether reinforcements would come again or whether they were still trapped behind enemy lines. But the longer the fire burned, the less it mattered. For one night, war's logic had collapsed. Just before dawn, Lieutenant Lee walked the perimeter with his flashlight, inspecting the shattered parapets and bullet-pocked towers. In the pale glow he saw what was left of Basat and Jenny, the Sherman that had anchored their defense. Its barrel drooped, its paint blackened from heat, but on its flank the white star was still visible through the soot. He touched the metal as though greeting an old friend. The radio inside finally caught a faint signal. American voices, distant but real. Reinforcements were on the way to evacuate the prisoners and secure the valley. Lee exhaled slowly. When he returned to the courtyard, he found Jean Borotra sitting on a crate, his tennis whites stained with dirt and blood, staring toward the mountains. "You're going home soon," Lee said. Borotra smiled weakly. "After tonight, I am not sure where home is." By mid-morning, the rumble of engines rose again from the valley, the sound of another American column climbing the winding road. The relief force entered cautiously, guns at the ready, but what they found stopped them cold. Wehrmacht soldiers standing guard beside Americans, French dignitaries waving from the gate, and a castle draped with both the stars and stripes and a makeshift white flag stitched from tablecloths. Reporters would later call it the strangest battle of the war, a story so improbable that editors demanded confirmation before printing it. The rescuing officers recorded names, took photographs, and collected statements. They counted 39 defenders in total, including 14 Germans who had defected to protect the prisoners. The dead SS soldiers outside the walls numbered more than 100. The scene looked less like a battlefield and more like an ancient painting of redemption. Light slanting through smoke, uniforms of every color scattered across the ground. When the evacuation began, the French prisoners hesitated to leave. They gathered near the gate, shaking hands with their rescuers, pressing gifts of cigarettes and medals into calloused palms. Paul Renault embraced Lee and whispered, "You have given us back our dignity." Gamlin saluted the German soldiers who had survived, saying, "You chose honor when your leaders had none." Even the Americans, hardened by months of war, felt a lump in their throats as the convoy rolled away down the mountain road. The trucks disappeared one by one into the mist, engines echoing through the valley until only silence remained. That evening, the defenders dismantled their makeshift barricades. The battle had lasted less than 24 hours, yet it felt like a lifetime. As dusk settled, Lee gathered his men and the remaining Germans around the fire once more. "Tomorrow we'll head down and link up with the division," he said. "After that, we're all just soldiers again. No more lines." One of Gangl's men, a young corporal named Kurt Sporer, stared into the flames and said softly, "There shouldn't have been lines to begin with." No one answered, but no one disagreed. In the weeks that followed, the world raced to make sense of what had happened. News of the battle reached Allied headquarters, where officers shook their heads at the absurdity of it. How could a handful of Americans and defecting Germans have held off a full SS battalion? The official reports reduced it to a footnote: engagement near Wörgl, minor resistance encountered. But among the men who had been there, the memory burned bright. Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, though he joked that he would have preferred a week of sleep instead. He returned to the United States later that year, haunted by the image of Major Gangl falling in the courtyard. He told interviewers, "If that German had lived, I'd have sworn him in myself." Gangl was buried with honors in Wörgl, the townspeople later naming a street after him. His wife laid flowers there every May 5th, long after the uniforms had faded and the flags had changed. For the French survivors, the event became a strange symbol of redemption. They had seen the worst of occupation and captivity, but at Castle Itter, they saw that even in defeat, humanity could still flicker through the cracks of ideology. Renaud wrote in his memoirs that it was proof that the end of the world can still hold moments of grace. Borotra returned to his career, later visiting the castle in 1960, to walk the courtyard where he had once carried messages through gunfire. The bullet holes were still visible in the stone. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, and whispered, "Merci." Years turned into decades, and the story drifted toward legend. The world preferred clean narratives, heroes and villains neatly defeated, but Castle Itter defied that simplicity. Historians who rediscovered the battle in the 1980s called it the strangest alliance of the war, yet even that label failed to capture its quiet enormity. It wasn't strange, it was inevitable, the final, exhausted rebellion of ordinary men who had seen too much death to keep obeying madness. The war had begun with flags and anthems, but it ended here with tired soldiers sharing a cigarette under a broken tower. As twilight fell on that final night of May 5th, 1945, the castle stood scarred but alive, the valley below wrapped in fog and silence. The fires burned low, and the men drifted to sleep where they sat. Somewhere a radio played faintly, broadcasting a world they no longer belonged to, a world that would wake tomorrow to peace. And if anyone had looked closely at those sleeping figures, American, German, French, they would have seen something that hadn't existed in Europe for years. Not victory, not surrender, but understanding. When the trucks carrying the French prisoners vanished into the mist, and the rumble of their engines faded down the valley, silence reclaimed Castle Itter once more. The men left behind, Americans, Germans, and a handful of locals, stood amid the ruins of their brief brotherhood, unsure what to do next. The castle smelled of smoke and cold stone, the fires from the night before now only embers glowing faintly against the damp dawn. Lieutenant Jack Lee walked the courtyard slowly, boots crunching over bullet casings, eyes drawn to the places where blood had dried into the cracks of the old masonry. He had fought in France, crossed the Rhine, watched towns burn, but nothing in the war had felt like this. He could not shake the image of Major Gangl falling, the German officer who had died defending men he once would have saluted as enemies. Around Lee, his crew worked in silence, stripping ammunition belts, patching holes in besotten Jenny's armor with whatever scrap they could find. The young German soldiers who had fought beside them waited nearby, their rifles stacked neatly against a wall, no longer sure whether they were prisoners or comrades. One of them, a boy barely 20, asked quietly in halting English, "What happens to us now?" Lee didn't know how to answer. Technically they were the enemy, but after what they'd done here, that word had lost its meaning. He handed the boy a cigarette and said, "You go home, when there's a home to go to." That afternoon, the first formal American patrols arrived, led by a major from divisional headquarters whose jeep still gleamed like it had rolled off a parade ground. He was baffled by what he found. German soldiers standing guard at an American checkpoint, a Sherman tank parked beside a wrecked Kubelwagen, and a castle full of mixed uniforms sharing rations. The major demanded an explanation, and Lee, tired beyond patience, simply pointed to the courtyard. "You're looking at it," he said. "We fought the SS together. They were trying to kill the prisoners. These men helped stop them." The major scribbled notes, shaking his head. "You realize how this looks on paper?" Lee smirked. "Doesn't matter how it looks. It's what happened." Orders came down the next day to disarm the Germans formally and escort them to the rear for processing. The moment was awkward, almost ceremonial. The Americans collected the rifles, but no one raised a weapon. There was no hostility left, only fatigue. One of Gangl's sergeants saluted Lee before surrendering his pistol, saying in German, "For one day, we were brothers." Lee nodded and replied softly, "The best day of the war." In the village of Wurgel below, news of the battle spread faster than any report could be written. Civilians emerged from cellars, white flags hanging from windows, uncertain which army would reach them next. Some wept openly when they saw American tanks roll through. Others stared in disbelief at Wehrmacht soldiers riding beside them. For years the town had lived under the shadow of SS terror, and now those same symbols of fear were turning on their masters. The people buried their dead quietly and began the slow task of cleaning streets littered with shell casings and broken glass. In one square, villagers placed flowers beneath a wooden cross marked with a single name, Josef Gangl. To them, he was not a traitor, but a man who had chosen conscience over command. In the following days, word reached the castle that Germany's surrender was imminent. Rumors came first, then confirmation. May 8, 1945, would be the official end of hostilities in Europe. Lee received the news by radio at midday, sitting on the castle wall with his boots hanging over the edge. For a long time, he didn't move. The war he had lived and breathed for 3 years was over, and yet the world below still looked wounded, half dead. He wondered what men like Gangl would have thought of it, whether peace could ever mean anything after so much loss. That night, the sky lit with flares from distant celebrations. Artillery boomed not in anger but in triumph, the sound rolling across the mountains like thunder announcing a storm's retreat. Yet inside the castle, no one cheered. The Americans sat quietly, listening to the echoes, each man lost in his own thoughts. Sergeant Wallace leaned against the tank's tread and said, "So this is victory, huh? Doesn't feel like it." Lee just nodded. Victory was supposed to taste like glory. All he felt was tired. 2 days later, a war correspondent arrived with a photographer, his jeep splattered with mud, a typewriter strapped to the back seat. He had come chasing rumors, whispers of a castle where Nazis and Americans had fought side by side. Lee led him through the ruins, explaining what he could. The journalist kept stopping to scribble, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're telling me you fought with them?" he asked. "With Germans?" Lee replied, "No, with men." The reporter smiled faintly at that, but looked skeptical, like someone trying to fit a square truth into a round idea. He filed the story weeks later, buried deep in the international pages, because editors thought it sounded too strange to be real. It barely made a ripple, lost among headlines of Hitler's death and the fall of Berlin. In the days that followed, the surviving German soldiers were processed and released into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some disappeared into refugee columns, others returned to their shattered hometowns. Lee never saw them again. He and his crew remained stationed in Austria through the summer, guarding supply depots and escorting civilians. But the bond forged in that battle lingered. He kept a small photo in his pocket, a grainy snapshot taken by the journalist showing him and Gangl standing side by side in front of the castle gate, both squinting into the sun. Years later, when he showed it to his grandchildren, they would ask which man was the enemy, and Lee would say, "Neither." Meanwhile, the French prisoners who had survived the ordeal became living symbols of resilience. When they reached Paris, crowds greeted them as heroes, though few knew what they had endured in that remote fortress. Paul Reynaud gave interviews describing the strange alliance, calling it a spark of reason in a world gone insane. His words resonated briefly, but Within months, France was consumed with rebuilding, and the story faded. Jean Borotra returned to tennis, his legend growing, but every May he would send a telegram to the American division headquarters, simply reading, "Merci from Itter." Sometimes the message never reached its destination. Sometimes it arrived with no one left who remembered. Back in Austria, Castle Itter became a curiosity. Soldiers stationed nearby called it the Lucky Castle. Locals whispered it was haunted by ghosts who couldn't decide which flag to salute. The bullet holes remained, scars etched into stone as silent witnesses. The castle's caretaker kept a journal, describing what he found after the armies left: empty shell casings, a burned tank tread, a torn scrap of paper with the words, "Hold this damn castle," scrawled in pencil. No museum claimed the artifacts, no historian came to record them. Europe was moving on, racing to rebuild from rubble and famine. By autumn, the war had turned into memory. The Allied occupation divided the continent into zones, borders redrawn by victors who had never heard of the battle that defied those borders entirely. Lee's unit was reassigned to Germany, where he watched cities rise from ashes and old enemies become administrators. He couldn't help thinking of the absurd symmetry of it all, how the men who had fought beside him at Castle Itter might now be sweeping streets under Allied supervision. Yet he felt no bitterness. He wrote in a letter to his wife, "Maybe this is what winning really means, not burning everything down, but finding someone left to rebuild with." The world, however, preferred simpler stories. The headlines celebrated generals, not tank commanders. The medals went to those whose victories fit neatly into strategy maps. Castle Itter was too strange, too human, to fit the narrative of conquest. Official histories of the European campaign devoted only a sentence or two to a localized defense action involving mixed forces. For decades, that was all the world knew. But for the men who had been there, the reckoning never ended. At night, Lee dreamed of the castle walls, the echo of machine guns, the smell of pine and cordite. He saw Gangl's face every time he closed his eyes. Sometimes he would wake before dawn, heart pounding, convinced he still heard the growl of engines in the distance. When his wife asked what troubled him, he would only say, "We won, but it cost us the part that knew how to hate." He lived quietly in Texas after the war, working as a mechanic, avoiding parades and interviews. To him, the war's only honest story was the one no one wanted to hear, that decency had outlived ideology in the most unlikely place. By the time the world officially learned of Castle Itter decades later, most of its defenders were gone, yet the story, once unearthed, refused to fade again. It was too strange, too pure to ignore. Historians would later call it the last battle of Europe, but those who study it understand it was something rarer, the moment the war forgot to be war. The war ended on paper, but for the men who had survived Castle Itter, peace arrived like a dream they could not wake from. The castle itself was left abandoned, a hollow monument on the ridge above Gangl, its walls still tattooed with bullet scars, its gatehouse sagging where shells had torn through. For a few weeks after the surrender, American troops patrolled the valley, checking on the villagers and collecting stray SS fugitives. Lieutenant Jack Lee was among them, his Sherman repaired and his uniform washed, but his mind still circling back to that night when everything he knew about the enemy had come undone. He had seen German soldiers die to protect French prisoners, watched former foes fight side by side without orders or ideology. No briefing could explain it, no commendation could capture it. When he looked at his medals, they felt like souvenirs from another man's war. He spent his last days in Austria helping organize supply runs for displaced civilians, handing out rations to mothers and children who stared at him with the wide, silent eyes of people who had forgotten how to trust. Once, he saw a German boy wearing a tattered Luftwaffe cap and almost smiled before realizing it was being used to carry potatoes. That small, absurd image stuck with him more than any parade he would later attend. When his orders came through in late summer, he left Europe quietly, no farewell ceremony, no fanfare. He flew back to the United States, stepping off the transport plane into a world of neon lights and victory posters, where strangers smiled at soldiers on the street and called them heroes. But every time someone asked what the war had been like, he found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain the chaos, the contradictions, the moment when the enemy had become an ally for a single day? He simply said, "We did what we had to do," and left it at that. He married, opened a small auto repair shop, and tried to live as if the castle were just another story. Yet at night, when engines backfired or thunder rolled over the plains, he would wake with the taste of smoke in his mouth, convinced for a moment that he was back on that mountain, the gunfire echoing in his ears. Back in Austria, the valley of Gangl began to heal, slowly and unevenly. The villagers rebuilt their homes with salvaged timber, planted new crops, and spoke little about the war. The name Josef Gangl became a kind of local legend, told in whispers and half-remembered details. His wife, Maria, received a small pension from the new Austrian government and raised their young son alone. Every May she walked to the simple grave on the hillside, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers and standing for hours in silence. To the townspeople, she was both a widow and a symbol of something larger, a reminder that not all uniforms had meant cruelty. The mayor of Gangl petitioned to rename one of the main streets in Gangl's honor, and when the new sign was unveiled, the ceremony drew a small crowd. No reporters came, no photographers, but for the villagers, it meant the world. A former German officer had become a hero of humanity, proof that conscience had survived even in the Reich's dying breath. The French officers who had been imprisoned in the castle returned to their fractured homeland as living relics of a war that France wanted to forget. Paul Reynaud tried to resume his political career, only to find the nation consumed by bitterness and rebuilding. He wrote of Castle Itter only briefly in his memoirs, describing it as a brief flash of sanity amid the ruins. General Gamelin retreated into quiet obscurity, avoiding the public eye. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion whose daring escape had saved them all, returned to the courts and the roar of crowds, but fame felt hollow after what he had seen. Every May 5th, he paused wherever he was, stood in silence, and whispered the names of those who had fought to save him. He never missed a year. For the German soldiers who had fought beside the Americans, life after the war was a maze of suspicion and survival. Many of them were captured by Allied authorities and held in makeshift camps until their loyalties could be sorted out. Some were released within months, others spent years proving they had not been part of the SS. A few changed their names entirely, blending into the anonymity of the post-war world. None spoke publicly about Castle Itter. To talk of it would have been to admit fighting alongside the enemy, something few wanted to explain to their families or the occupying forces. Their silence became another casualty of history. By the early 1950s, the story of the battle had all but vanished. The official U.S. Army reports listed it as a minor engagement in the Tyrol, and the documents were buried deep in archives. Newspapers focused on Reconstruction, on the Marshall Plan, on the new Cold War that divided Europe once again. The idea of Americans and Germans fighting together no longer fit the political narrative. The war needed to remain clean. Villains and victors, no gray between. The castle faded into the mist of memory, its stones growing moss, its story whispered only by locals to curious hikers. The few who knew the truth carried it quietly, like a shared secret. Jack Lee lived long enough to watch the world change again. He saw televisions replace radios, jets replace propellers, and new wars fought for reasons as tangled as the old ones. In the 1960s, a young journalist tracked him down in Texas after stumbling upon a declassified report about a joint defense of Allied VIPs at Castle Itter. The reporter wanted a headline, but Lee refused in interviews. "The war's over," he said. "Let it stay buried." When pressed, he only said, "It wasn't about sides. It was about people who decided not to be monsters." The article that followed was short and skeptical, and the story slipped away once more. It wasn't until decades later that history rediscovered the battle in earnest. In the 1980s, an Austrian historian researching resistance movements stumbled upon local records of Gangl's death and began piecing together what had really happened. He interviewed surviving villagers, tracked down letters, and found faded photographs of the castle in ruins. Slowly, the story emerged. The last battle of Europe, where enemies became brothers. Books were written, documentaries filmed, each one marveling at how such an extraordinary moment could have been forgotten. The tone was always the same, astonishment mixed with reverence, as if humanity had briefly woken from its nightmare before falling back asleep. Meanwhile, the castle itself endured. Its walls were restored, its towers rebuilt, but the bullet marks were left untouched by order of the local council. Visitors came from around the world, walking the same courtyard where men had once fought and died together. Tour guides pointed to the patched stanzas and told the tale in soft voices, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts. On clear days, the view stretched across the valley, serene and green, utterly at odds with the horror it had once witnessed. Children ran where soldiers had fallen, laughter echoed where gunfire had roared, and yet, if one stood still long enough, the wind seemed to carry faint whispers of that strange alliance, the sound of a world, if only for a day, remembering its humanity. As the century turned, historians began to reevaluate the moral complexity of the war, and Castle Itter stood as a symbol of the paradox at its heart. In an age obsessed with heroes and villains, it reminded the world that decency can wear any uniform. The story appeared in classrooms and history magazines, cited as proof that, even amid the machinery of genocide, some refused to become machines themselves. But for those who had lived it, the rediscovery was bittersweet. Jack Lee's children, long grown, found their father's medals and a letter he had written, but never mailed. It read, "If anyone ever asks what we were fighting for, tell them it wasn't land or politics. Tell them it was for a few hours of truth in a world of lies." Maria Gangl lived to see the street bearing her husband's name become part of a thriving town. On the 40th anniversary of the battle, she attended a memorial at the castle, now preserved as a historic site. American veterans, French dignitaries, and Austrian officials stood together beneath the rebuilt archway. When Maria laid a wreath beneath the flagpole, the crowd fell silent. For a moment, it felt as if the mountains themselves held their breath. A French officer stepped forward and saluted. An American veteran removed his cap. Someone began to weep softly. No speeches followed, because none were needed. The silence said everything. In the decades that followed, the story of Castle Itter became a quiet legend, passed through documentaries, novels, and classrooms. Yet, even as it gained fame, it retained a strange intimacy, as if it belonged not to nations, but to humanity itself. People from around the world visited to leave flowers, flags, or handwritten notes, thanking the men who had chosen compassion over obedience. The castle, once a prison, had become a sanctuary of memory. By the time the 21st century arrived, only the walls remained unchanged. The rest of the world had moved on. New wars, new borders, new hatreds. But Castle Itter stood as proof that even in the darkest chapters of history, light had found a way through. Tourists walked through its halls without realizing that beneath their feet lay the ghosts of a day when the impossible became real. And as the wind swept across the Tyrol and rustled the flags above its towers, it carried the echo of that one truth. That peace is not a treaty or a surrender, but a choice made by men who remember what it means to be human. In the quiet years that followed, the story of Castle Itter lived less as history and more as a whisper, the kind of tale that refused to die because it contained something the world was always in danger of forgetting. Time erased the uniforms, the ideologies, the maps that once divided continents, but not the memory of that single day when enemies stood shoulder to shoulder against a greater darkness. It became a story people told to remind themselves that courage and conscience are not owned by nations, that sometimes the truest victory is simply refusing to surrender your humanity. If you walk the castle grounds today, you can still see the bullet scars along the parapets, small pits in the ancient stone where machine gun fire once tore through the mist. The air is still, the valley green and silent, the mountains standing eternal like sentinels who remember more than they speak. The castle's courtyard feels unchanged, echoes of boots on cobblestone, the faint hum of wind through broken shutters, the scent of pine drifting in from the forest. Tourists wander with cameras and guidebooks, smiling for pictures, unaware that under their feet lie fragments of history that once defied reason itself. Somewhere near the gate, a small plaque bears a simple inscription. In this place, on May 5, 1945, men who were enemies fought together for freedom and honor. People stop to read it, some for only a second, others for longer, their expressions shifting as they imagine what it must have looked like. The smoke, the shouting, the impossible alliance of men who should never have shared a cause. History tends to polish its edges, to sand away the contradictions that make us uncomfortable. We prefer heroes who stay heroic and villains who stay damned. But Castle Itter stands as a stubborn rejection of that comfort. It insists that morality is not drawn on a flag but chosen in a heartbeat, often by people the world has already condemned. Major Josef Gangl could have fled, could have hidden in the chaos of surrender, but he chose to drive into enemy territory to protect strangers. Lieutenant Jack Lee could have refused him, dismissed his plea as a trap, but he didn't. Each man in that moment made a decision not based on command or creed, but on the simple understanding that right and wrong do not change with language or uniform. Their story is the blueprint of every quiet act of decency that has ever stood against the machinery of cruelty. In the ledger of war, it was a small entry, barely noticed, yet it carries a weight far beyond its size. Because if a German officer and an American tank commander could recognize each other's humanity amid the ashes of 1945, then the rest of us have no excuse. The war that created them was supposed to define good and evil for a century, but real life never obeys those boundaries. The same world that celebrated liberation also rebuilt walls of ideology within a few years, dividing East from West, rewriting loyalty with a new vocabulary. And yet the lesson of Castle Itter outlived the Cold War, outlived its soldiers, because it was never about geopolitics. It was about conscience. When people ask what the battle means, historians speak of irony, of absurdity, of chance. But perhaps it was not absurd at all. Perhaps it was inevitable that after so many years of hate, the human instinct to protect one another would break through, even if only for a single day. It was as if history itself grew weary of its own cruelty and, for a few hours, allowed mercy to take command. In the decades since, writers and filmmakers have tried to capture that feeling, to explain what made those men act as they did. Some say it was desperation, others duty, others divine intervention. But maybe it was something simpler. Maybe it was fatigue. Not the kind that comes from marching or fighting, but from watching the world burn and realizing that victory without compassion is just another form of defeat. The men at Castle Itter had seen too much, lost too much, to keep pretending that the lines drawn by generals meant anything. In the end, it wasn't ideology that held the castle. It was empathy. That, more than any weapon, was what turned back the darkness. Every war produces its miracles, small and temporary, and Castle Itter was one of them. For one day, hatred ran out of ammunition. For one day, the walls built by propaganda crumbled faster than the fortress under siege. And for one day, men remembered that courage and mercy can share the same heartbeat. That memory still hums in the stones, carried by the mountain wind. At night, when the valley is quiet and the stars scatter across the Tyrolean sky, it's easy to imagine the silhouettes of those soldiers standing once more on the ramparts. Some in German gray, some in American olive, all looking outward into the same darkness, guarding a peace they never lived to see. Jack Lee died in the 1980s, long after the war's noise had faded into the hum of television news and new conflicts. He was buried without ceremony, his name barely mentioned outside military records. Yet among the few who knew his story, there was a sense that he had glimpsed something the rest of the world only talks about. In his last years, when asked by a journalist if he ever hated the enemy, he replied, "Once, yes, but not after the castle. You can't hate someone who bled beside you." It was the simplest and truest summation of what had happened on that mountain. The journalist printed the quote in a small column, and it was reprinted years later on a memorial plaque, where it remains today beneath his name. Time has a way of turning horror into numbers, of reducing the infinite tragedies of war into dates and casualty counts. But Castle Itter resists that reduction. It doesn't fit neatly into strategy charts or campaign maps. It sits apart, a story that refuses to follow orders. It belongs not to the victors or the defeated, but to anyone who has ever chosen kindness when cruelty was easier. Historians call it the last battle, but maybe it was the first act of peace. Its legacy is not measured in territory gained or lives lost, but in what it revealed, that even at the end of civilization's darkest chapter, there were still men willing to remember what civilization meant. And so, the castle stands, watching centuries pass. The trees grow thick again around its slopes, the stone walls bloom with ivy, and the echoes of gunfire have long since turned into birdsong. But if you listen carefully, if the wind is just right, you might still hear the faint echo of that impossible morning, the voices shouting across languages, the rumble of engines, the clash of fire and resolve. And beneath it all, a quieter sound, the moment when fear gave way to courage and hatred gave way to mercy. Because in the end, that is what Castle Itter truly was, not a battle, not a miracle, but a reminder A reminder that the lines we draw between ourselves are far more fragile than we think. A reminder that goodness can survive even in uniform. A reminder that, for one brief day in May of 1945, the world stopped choosing sides and started choosing right. And when the sun rose the next morning over the Tyrolean mountains, it shone not on victors or vanquished, but on men who had, if only for a heartbeat, remembered how to be human.